This little street kid was going through her normal routine until a millionaire calls her out for a fight. The girl's reaction is shocking, but 2 minutes later, it's the millionaire who's crying, and the reason will make you cry too. Comment: who is the person in your family that you love the most, and subscribe to the channel to support my work. John woke up startled in his king-size bed, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. It was the same nightmare as always, the phone ringing, the choked voice of the police officer on the other end of the line, the news that would change his life forever. 10 years had passed, but the pain was as vivid as it was that fateful night. His wife Sarah and his son Mikey, just 7 years old, were coming back from a birthday party when a semi-truck lost control. He should have been with them, but a last-minute meeting prevented him from going. The clock read 5:30 a.m. It was useless trying to go back to sleep. John got up and walked to the window of his luxurious penthouse, watching the city begin to wake up. At 45, he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. He had enough money for several lifetimes, but none of it mattered. Guilt consumed him daily, corroding his soul like an invisible acid. He followed his mechanical routine: strong black coffee, impeccable Italian suit, shining leather shoes. He went down to the garage and got into his latest model Mercedes. The chauffeur was already waiting for him, as he had every day for the past few years. John didn't even remember how to drive anymore. He had been afraid to get behind the wheel since the accident. On the way to the office, something unusual caught his attention. In the city's central park, a small figure was moving in a peculiar way. He asked the driver to stop. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, performing movements that resembled martial arts strikes. She wore tattered clothes and had disheveled hair, but her eyes shone with a determination that John hadn't seen in a long time. "You can wait a moment," he said to the driver, getting out of the car. He approached slowly, watching the girl continue her movements, completely absorbed in her own world. She was kicking the air with impressive precision for someone so small. "Have you been training for a long time?" John asked, startling the girl. "I learned by myself, watching the fighters at the gym over there," she replied, pointing to an old building across the street. "My name is Carmen." Something in her voice made John's heart clench. Mikey also loved martial arts. He had reached the yellow belt in Taekwondo and dreamed of being a world champion one day. "Want to try a move with me?" The words came out of his mouth before he could think. Carmen's eyes widened, a smile lighting up her dirty face. They simulated a small fight right there in the park. Carmen was agile and determined. Her movements, although imprecise, showed a natural talent. For 2 minutes, John forgot who he was, forgot his pain, forgot the empire he built trying to bury his memories. When they finished, he noticed that the girl was panting not only from the exercise, but also from hunger. Her arms were too thin, her cheeks too sunken. "Do you want to have lunch with me?" he asked, already walking towards a nearby diner. During lunch, Carmen devoured 3 plates. Between bites, she told her story. She lived in the park with other homeless people, surviving on donations. Her parents had disappeared 2 years ago, leaving her alone in the world. John watched her in silence, a knot growing in his throat. When she finished her meal, he left Carmen in the park and returned to his car. As soon as the door closed, the tears came, thick, heavy, uncontrollable. The driver discreetly pretended not to notice. That night in his empty penthouse, John couldn't get Carmen out of his thoughts. The determination in her eyes, the passion for fighting, everything reminded him of Mikey. He opened a drawer he had kept locked for years and took out a small photo album. On the first page, Mikey smiled proudly in his white dobok, showing off his yellow belt next to Master Johnson. Master Johnson. It had been a decade since he spoke to him. After the accident, he cut all ties that reminded him of Mikey. But now something compelled him to make contact again. He spent the night awake, fighting against his own demons. The next morning, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, but a renewed determination, John made a decision. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring Mikey back, but maybe he could do something for that girl who, like his son, dreamed of martial arts. He found Carmen in the same place, performing her imaginary moves. When she saw him, her eyes lit up in recognition. "I have a proposition for you," John said, sitting on a nearby bench. "How about learning real taekwondo, with a master?" Carmen stopped her movements, looking at him with suspicion. Life on the streets had taught her to doubt the kindness of strangers. "Why?" she asked simply. John hesitated. How could he explain that she had awakened something he thought was dead? How to say that seeing her fight, he felt Mikey closer than in all these years of mourning? "Because you have talent," he finally replied, "and talent shouldn't be wasted." Carmen continued looking at him, her small eyes studying every detail of his face, as if searching for signs of lies. Finally, she nodded slightly. "And how much does it cost?" she asked, already lowering her eyes, certainly knowing that she couldn't afford it. "Don't worry about that," John replied. "I'll pay for everything." That afternoon, John took Carmen to Master Johnson's dojo. The place had changed little in the last decade. The same smell of sweat and determination, the same blue mats, the same walls decorated with Korean symbols. Master Johnson was older, his hair now completely white, but his eyes still had the same wise gleam as before. When he saw John, he stopped. In the middle of his class, an expression of surprise and emotion crossing his face. "Master," John began, his voice failing slightly, "I brought someone who would very much like to learn from you." Carmen hid partially behind John. Suddenly, shy in the formal environment of the dojo, Master Johnson approached, kneeling to be at her height. "And what is your name, little one?" he asked with his gentle voice. "Carmen," she replied quietly, but her eyes were already curiously studying the students training in the background. Master Johnson observed her bare feet, her worn clothes, but mostly the determined posture she maintained, even in her nervousness. Then he looked at John, a silent question in his eyes. John just nodded. That moment marked not only the beginning of Carmen's training, but also his own return to a place he had avoided for so long, the place where his son had been happiest. Little did he know that this decision would not only change Carmen's life, but also stir up deep wounds that he thought were healed. Fate had bigger plans than any of them could imagine. The first day of training was harder than Carmen imagined. Used to copying movements by watching from afar, she now needed to follow a strict discipline. The white dobok that John had bought seemed heavy on her frail body. Her feet, calloused from walking barefoot through the streets, now touched the soft mats of the dojo. Master Johnson was patient but demanding. Each movement needed to be repeated dozens of times until it reached the desired standard. Carmen sweated, her legs trembled, but she didn't complain. For her, that pain was different from all the others she had felt in her life. It was a pain that made her stronger. John watched the training from afar, sitting on a bench in the corner of the dojo. Every time Carmen executed a kick, his mind transported him 10 years into the past. He saw Mikey there, small and determined, training tirelessly to master each technique. The resemblance was so great that sometimes he had to look away, the tears threatening to fall. But there was a problem that neither John nor Master Johnson could ignore. Carmen still lived on the streets. After each training session, she returned to the park, sleeping in the open, exposed to all the dangers of the night. Winter was approaching, and the temperatures were beginning to drop dangerously. On a particularly cold night, John couldn't sleep. The image of Carmen huddled in some corner of the park tormented him. He got up, put on a coat, and drove there. For the first time in 10 years, he took the wheel himself. He found her sleeping inside a cardboard box, covered only by old newspapers. His heart clenched. How could he demand that she train? That she'd dedicate herself to the sport if she didn't even have a safe place to sleep? But the idea of taking her to his house scared him. It wasn't just the legal issue. It was the fear of becoming attached, of suffering again, of losing someone else he loved. The next morning, Carmen arrived at training with deep, dark circles under her eyes and shivering with cold. During the easy warm-up, her movements were slower than normal. Master Johnson noticed and called her over to talk. "What's wrong, little one? You seem tired today." Carmen hesitated before answering. "There was a new group in the park last night. They were drinking and making a lot of noise. I couldn't sleep well." Master Johnson looked significantly at John, who was watching the conversation from his usual place. This situation couldn't continue. That same afternoon, something happened that forced a decision. During training, Carmen fainted. When she woke up, she confessed that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. The group that had arrived at the park had stolen the little money she had managed to scrape together. It was at that moment that John felt something inside him break. He remembered what it was like to be a father, what it was like to protect someone, what it was like to love unconditionally. He looked at Carmen, so small and vulnerable on the gurney in the dojo's first aid room, and made his decision. "You're going to live with me," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Carmen's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear in her gaze. "But why?" "Because I can't leave you on the streets, because you deserve a chance, because—" He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "Because maybe we both need this." The transition wasn't easy. Carmen had never lived in a real house with rules and schedules. In the first few days, she would wake up startled in the middle of the night, disoriented by being in a soft bed instead of the hard ground of the park. She had difficulty using silverware correctly, taking a shower every day, following a routine. John, in turn, needed to relearn how to share his space, how to care for another human being. He had put away all the photos of his family, turning his penthouse into an aseptic and impersonal environment. Now, little by little, the place was beginning to come alive again. But not everything was rosy. The news that John had taken a street girl to live with him began to circulate in his social circle. The malicious comments were not long in coming. His sister, Marcia, was the first to express her disapproval. She showed up unannounced at his penthouse, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Have you lost your mind?" she snapped as soon as she entered. "Bringing a street girl into your house, you don't know anything about her family. What if she's dangerous? What if she's part of some scheme to rob you?" John tried to explain, tried to make Marcia understand what even he didn't fully comprehend. But how to explain that, for the first time in 10 years, he felt he was doing something right? How to explain that, by helping Carmen, he felt he was somehow honoring Mikey's memory? Carmen heard the entire discussion from her room, the tears running silently down her face. She was used to being judged, to being seen as a problem, a threat. But for the first time, she had hope for a different life, and she didn't want to cause problems for John. The next morning, John found a note on his desk. "Thank you for everything, but it's better if I leave. I don't want to cause problems. For you." Panic took hold of him. He ran to Carmen's room. It was empty. He went down to the lobby of the building, his heart beating erratically. The doorman said he had seen her leave very early, carrying a small backpack. John ran to the park, searching frantically. He didn't find her. He went to the dojo. Nothing. Despair began to take over when he remembered there was a place where Carmen liked to train alone, a small, abandoned playground behind the dojo. There she was, executing her moves with a precision that only pain could bring. Her eyes were red from crying so much, but her movements showed no hesitation. "Carmen," he called softly. She stopped, but didn't turn to face him. "You don't need to leave," he said, his voice choked. "I don't care what others think. You made me remember what it's like to have a family." Carmen finally turned around, her eyes meeting John's. At that moment, something changed between them. They were no longer just a rich man trying to help a street girl. They were two wounded souls beginning to heal together. They went home in silence, but it was a different silence, full of unspoken promises. That night, for the first time, John took a photo of Mikey out of the drawer and put it on the bedside table. Carmen saw him doing this and timidly asked who the boy in the picture was. John sat next to her and, for the first time in 10 years, began to tell the story of his son. He talked about his smile, about his passion for taekwondo, about how he lit up every room he entered. The tears came, but this time they weren't just of pain. There was also gratitude for having found Carmen, for having a second chance to make a difference in someone's life. What neither of them knew was that this moment of connection would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The shadows of Carmen's past still haunted her, and John's ghosts were far from being exorcised. The path they chose to walk together was just beginning, and it would be much harder than either of them could predict. Over the months, Carmen began to stand out at the dojo. Her natural talent, combined with tireless dedication, made her progress rapidly. Master Johnson was impressed with her progress, but this same progress began to awaken bad feelings in some students. Marcia, a teenager from a wealthy family who had been training for years, couldn't accept seeing a street kid surpassing her abilities. It started subtly. Malicious comments during training, giggles when Carmen made a mistake, looks of disdain when she arrived at the dojo. In the beginning, Carmen tried to ignore it. Life on the streets had taught her that not all battles needed to be fought. But the situation gradually worsened. One day, she arrived for training and found that her dobok had disappeared from the locker room. The next day, her protective gear was torn. The following week, during a doubles training session, Marcia deliberately hit her with excessive force, injuring her shoulder. Master Johnson perceived what was happening, but he knew that this type of conflict needed to be resolved by the students themselves. It was part of the learning, of the growth. Carmen needed to learn to deal with envy and prejudice without losing her essence. At home, John noticed that something was wrong. Carmen was quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes he caught her crying alone in her room, but when he asked what had happened, she would brush it off. She didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want John to think that he had made a mistake in taking her in. One night, after a particularly difficult training session, Carmen decided to stay longer at the dojo to practice alone. John had an important meeting and couldn't pick her up, so she would take the bus home. When she was putting her equipment away in the locker room, she heard voices approaching. "Did you see how conceited she is? Just because that crazy businessman adopted her, she thinks she's someone?" It was Marcia's voice. "I bet she's running some kind of scam on him. These street people are all the same." Carmen felt her blood boil, but she took a deep breath, remembering Master Johnson's teachings about emotional control. She continued putting her things away, pretending not to hear. And the worst thing is that the Master only praises her. "Look, at Carmen's dedication, observe Carmen's technique," Marcia continued, imitating the Master's voice. "What's the point of training for years if any old beggar can come along and steal all the attention?" It was then that something unexpected happened. Another voice spoke up, a voice that Carmen didn't expect to hear defending her. "You're jealous, Marcia." It was Julia, one of the oldest students at the dojo. "Carmen trains harder than everyone. Here, while you're complaining, she's practicing. While you're spreading gossip, she's dedicating herself. Her talent doesn't diminish yours, but your attitude does." Carmen felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were different. For the first Time since she started training, she felt that she really belonged to that place. That night, when she arrived home, she found John waiting for her in the living room. His meeting had ended earlier, and he was visibly worried that she was so late. "Did something happen?" he asked, noticing her red eyes. Carmen hesitated. She had kept so many things inside, carried so many fears and insecurities alone. But now, looking at that man who had changed her life completely, she realized that she didn't have to face everything alone anymore. She sat next to him and, for the first time, told him everything. She talked about Marcia, about the bullying, about how she felt when people looked at her with contempt. She talked about her fear of disappointing him, about how each achievement at the dojo seemed to be accompanied by a new challenge. John listened to everything in silence, his heart clenching with each word. When Carmen finished, he hugged her tightly, letting her cry on his shoulder. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," he said softly. "You just need to be yourself with all your strength and determination. The rest will work itself out." But not everything would be resolved so easily. The following week, during an important class, Marcia went too far. During a sparring exercise, she completely ignored the safety rules and hit Carmen with an unauthorized kick, causing her to fall hard on the mat. Master Johnson immediately interrupted the class. His face, normally serene, was filled with a severity that few students had seen before. "Marcia, come here," he called, his voice cutting through the tense silence that had settled in the dojo. Marcia approached, trying to maintain an expression of innocence, but her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "What just happened goes against everything we teach here," the master began. "Taekwondo is not about hurting others. It's not about feeding the ego. It's about respect, discipline, and personal growth." He paused, looking at all the students before continuing. "Carmen came here with nothing but her determination, didn't have expensive equipment, didn't have years of training, didn't have a family to support her, but she had something much more important. She had heart, and that's what makes a true martial artist." Carmen, who had gotten up with Julia's help, felt her body aching, but her spirit was stronger than ever. The master's words touched something deep inside her. Marcia was suspended from training for a month, and her parents were called in for a serious conversation with Master Johnson. But the incident had an unexpected effect. Many students who had previously remained distant began to approach Carmen, impressed with her resilience and humility. At home that night, John found Carmen practicing her moves in the living room, even with her body all sore. "You don't need to train today," he said, concerned. "You need to rest." Carmen stopped, turning to him with a tired but determined smile. "You know what I learned today?" she asked. "That sometimes people will try to knock you down, but the important thing isn't how many times you fall. It's how many times you get back up." John felt his heart clench. That girl had a wisdom that went far beyond her age, a strength that not even she fully knew. "You remind me so much of him," he said softly, more to himself than to Carmen. "Mikey?" she asked hesitantly. It was still rare for John to talk about his son. "Yes," he replied, sitting on the couch. "He also never gave up, no matter how hard it was. When he injured his ankle before an important competition, he trained sitting down, practicing only arm movements. He said he couldn't stop just because one part of him wasn't working." Carmen sat next to him, absorbing every word. It was precious when John shared memories of Mikey, and she kept each one of them with care. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice choked, "I see so much of him in you that it hurts, but it's a different pain now. It's like he guided me to you." That night, something changed in the relationship between them. They were no longer just a man trying to help a street girl or a child grateful for a chance in life. They were a family, built not by blood but by pain, by overcoming challenges, and above all by love. What they didn't know was that the challenges they had faced up to that point were only the beginning. Fate still had many more trials in store for them, and their strength would be tested in ways that neither of them could imagine. Winter arrived, in full force that year, bringing with it not only the cold, but also memories that John preferred to keep buried. It was on a night as cold as that one that he lost his family. The accident happened during a snowstorm, when visibility on the road was almost zero. 10 years later, he still woke up in a cold sweat when the temperatures plummeted. Carmen noticed the changes in John's behavior. He was quieter, more distant, spending hours looking out the window with a lost look. During training, she caught him several times with tears in his eyes, especially when she managed to execute some movement that, according to Master Johnson, was exactly how Mikey did it. On one of those difficult nights, Carmen heard noises coming from John's office. It was late, past midnight, and she should have been sleeping. But something compelled her to get up and check. She found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by old photos, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. "I should have been there," he murmured when he noticed her presence. "I was supposed to be in the car with them. If I hadn't been stuck in that damn meeting." Carmen approached slowly, sitting next to him. She picked up one of the photos scattered on the floor. It showed Mikey smiling, embraced with his parents in front of a birthday cake. "You can't blame yourself forever," she said softly. "I'm sure they wouldn't want that." John looked up at her, surprised by the maturity of her words. How could a girl of only 12 years have so much wisdom? "You know," Carmen continued, "when my parents abandoned me, I also blamed myself for a long time. I thought that if I had been a better daughter, more obedient, they would have stayed. But I learned that sometimes bad things happen without us being able to do anything." Her words hit John like a punch in the stomach. In all those months, Carmen had never talked about her parents, about how she was abandoned. He respected her silence, hoping that one day she would feel safe enough to share her story. "What was it like?" he asked gently, putting the bottle of whiskey away in the drawer. Carmen took a deep breath, playing with the hem of her pajamas while organizing her thoughts. "I was 8 years old. We lived in a small room in the back of a bar. My dad drank a lot. My mum worked 2 jobs to try to make ends meet. One day, I woke up and they had simply left. They just left a note saying they couldn't take care of me anymore." John felt his heart clench. How could someone abandon a child like that? "For a long time I kept waiting for them to come back," she continued. "I would sit on the doorstep of the bar, day after day, imagining that at any moment they would show up apologizing, saying it had been a mistake. But they never came back." Silent tears ran down Carmen's face, but her voice remained firm. "That's when I started watching the fighting classes at the dojo. Seeing those people training, focused, determined, gave me a purpose. I may not have a family, but I had a dream." John pulled Carmen into a tight hug, letting his own tears finally fall. There they were, 2 wounded souls trying to heal each other. "You have a family now," he whispered, "and I promise I will never abandon you." But fate had other plans. The next morning, John received a call that would change everything. It was his lawyer, with worrying news. "Mr. Perrinaud, we need to talk urgently," said the voice on the other end of the line. "There have been some complications regarding your guardianship of Carmen." John's blood ran cold. He scheduled a meeting for that same afternoon, his heart heavy with a bad feeling. At the lawyer's office, the news dropped like a bombshell. Carmen's parents had reappeared. They were claiming custody of their daughter, claiming they had recovered and could now take care of her. "But they abandoned her," John protested, his voice trembling with anger. "How can they just show up after 4 years and demand to take her away?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his face grave. "Legally, they still have rights over her. And you Well, you don't have any official documentation. Carmen is living with you without any legal backing. John felt the world spin. How had he been so careless, so focused on helping Carmen, on seeing her grow and develop, that he hadn't thought about the legal issues involved? "What can we do?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "We can file for guardianship, present evidence of abandonment, witnesses, but it will be a difficult battle. Blood ties still weigh heavily in the justice system." That night, John couldn't bring himself to tell Carmen about the situation. How to tell her that the people who had abandoned her now wanted to take her back? How to explain that? Legally, he had no rights over her. During training, he watched her execute her moves with the usual precision. She had evolved so much in recent months. She was no longer that scared girl from the park. She was a strong, determined fighter with a bright future ahead. Master Johnson noticed that something was wrong. He approached John while Carmen was practicing with other students. "The shadows have returned to your eyes, my friend," said the master softly. "What's happening?" John told the old master everything, his voice choked with emotion. Master Johnson listened in silence, his face becoming increasingly grave. "Fate, sometimes, tests us in cruel ways," he said finally. "But remember, Carmen is no longer that fragile girl you found in the park. She is a fighter now in every sense, and you also need to fight for her." The master's words echoed in John's mind throughout the night. He knew he needed to tell Carmen, but how? How to tell her that once again her life was about to be turned upside down? What he didn't know was that Carmen had already realized that something was wrong. She noticed the worried looks, the whispered conversations, the mysterious phone calls, and in her heart grew a fear that she thought she had overcome, the fear of being abandoned again. That night, while everyone was sleeping, Carmen got up silently and went to John's room. She stopped at the door, watching him sleep with a troubled expression. She wanted to wake him up, ask him what was happening, beg him not to send her away, but something stopped her. Instead, she returned to her room and took her diary, a gift that John had given her in her first month at the house. She wrote for hours, putting on paper all her fears, her hopes, her love for this new family that she had found. What none of them imagined was that the real battle was just beginning. Carmen's parents weren't just interested in getting their daughter back. There was something else. Something that would only be revealed in the coming days, something that would test the bonds between Carmen and John in a way that neither of them was prepared to face. The next morning, John woke up determined to tell Carmen the truth. He found her in the kitchen, preparing his breakfast before training. She had learned to make scrambled eggs exactly the way he liked them. No salt, with a little chives. "Carmen, we need to talk," he said, sitting down at the table. She stopped what she was doing, her whole body tensing. During her life on the streets, she had learned that nothing good came after that phrase. "Your parents have been in contact," John said, deciding to be direct. They want you back." The plate that Carmen was holding slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. She stood there, staring at the shards, as if she couldn't process what she had just heard. "No," she whispered finally. "No, they can't. They abandoned me." John got up, wanting to hug her, but she recoiled. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why, after so long?" "I don't know, kiddo, but I promise I'm going to fight for you. I won't let them take you." Carmen finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't want to go," she said firmly. "You're my family now." That afternoon during training, Carmen fought with an intensity that frightened even Master Johnson. Each kick, each punch, carried the weight of her emotions. Her eyes were red, but no tears fell. After training, when everyone had already left, Master Johnson called her over to talk. "True strength isn't just in the muscles," he said, serving tea for both of them. "It's here," he pointed to his heart. "And here," he pointed to his head. "Master," Carmen began, her voice small, "why do people hurt those they should protect?" The old master sighed, remembering when Mikey had asked equally profound questions. Sometimes people are so lost in their own pain that they can't see the suffering they cause to others, but that doesn't justify their actions. Meanwhile, in his lawyer's office, John faced a different battle. The documents spread across the table painted a worrying picture. "Your parents claim they went through a rehabilitation program," the lawyer explained. "They have stable jobs now, their own house. In the eyes of the law, they seem to have recovered." "What about the 4 years of abandonment?" John asked, his voice filled with bitterness. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "It does, but they have an explanation for that too. They say it was a moment of despair, that they needed to treat themselves first in order to care for her properly." John ran his hands over his face, trying to control his frustration. "What are our chances?" "Honestly, not very good. You don't have any formal custody papers. In the eyes of the law, you're just a stranger who took in a minor." But there was something else, something that the lawyer was reluctant to say. "There's one more thing," he said finally. They're implying that your relationship with Carmen may not be appropriate." John felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "How dare they?" His voice trembled with anger. "After abandoning their own daughter, they have the nerve to—" I know, the lawyer interrupted. "But we need to prepare ourselves. They're going to play dirty." That night, when John arrived home, he found Carmen sitting on the couch, hugging the old doll she had found among her belongings when she moved in. "You know," she began without looking at him, "when they left this doll with me. It was the only thing I had of my mum. I kept it for years, imagining that one day she would come back to get it." John sat next to her, his heart clenching. "But now," Carmen continued, "it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just an old doll. My real family is here." Before John could answer, the doorbell rang. His whole body tensed. It was late for visitors. When he opened the door, his blood ran cold. A man and a woman were standing there, their faces bearing an undeniable resemblance to Carmen. "Where is our daughter?" demanded the woman, trying to enter the apartment. John blocked the entrance with his body. "You can't just show up like this," he said firmly. "Everything needs to be done through legal channels." "Legal channels?" The man laughed bitterly. "She's our daughter. You have no right to her." "Your case." Noise attracted Carmen, who appeared in the hallway. Upon seeing her parents, she froze. "Carmen, my love." Her mother took a step forward, arms outstretched. "We've come to get you." But Carmen didn't move. Her eyes, normally so expressive, were cold as ice. "You abandoned me," she said simply. "You're not my parents anymore." "We were sick, honey," her mother explained, tears running down her face. "We needed to treat ourselves first. Now we're well. We can be a family again." "Family?" Carmen let out a humorless laugh. "Family doesn't abandon. Family doesn't leave a note and disappear for 4 years. Family—" Her voice faltered and she looked at John before continuing. "Family is who stays by your side in tough times. It's who supports you, who believes in you. It's who loves you even when you think you don't deserve to be loved." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Her parents seemed stunned by the maturity and firmness of her response. "You need to leave now," John said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Any contact must be made through the lawyers." After they left, John found Carmen on the mat he had installed in one of the spare rooms. She was punching the heavy bag with a frightening intensity. "Hey, kiddo," he called softly. "You're going to hurt your hands like that." She stopped, her hands trembling, her face wet with sweat and tears. "They can't take me, can they?" she asked, her voice broken. John wanted to say no, that he would never let that happen, but he couldn't lie to her. "We're going to fight," he promised instead, "with all our strength." What they didn't know was that that visit was just the beginning. Carmen's parents had a plan, and they weren't going to give up easily. In the coming weeks, their life would turn into a battlefield where the prize was much more than the custody of a child. It was the right of a family to remain united, even if it wasn't by blood ties. The following weeks were a real nightmare. Carmen's parents began a systematic campaign to discredit John. They spread rumors throughout the neighborhood, contacted tabloid newspapers, even hired a private investigator to investigate his life. The routine they had built with so much care began to crumble. Carmen could no longer concentrate on training, always looking over her shoulder, fearing that her parents would show up at any moment. John barely slept, consumed by worry and anger. One morning, upon arriving at the dojo, Carmen found Marcia whispering with a group of students, a tabloid newspaper in their hands. On the cover, a flashy headline, "Millionaire keeps minor at home under pretense of help." The photo showed John and Carmen leaving a restaurant, taken from a distance, as if they were criminals. "I always said there was something wrong," Marcia spoke loudly enough for Carmen to hear. "Nobody helps someone like that out of the blue. There must be ulterior motives." Carmen felt her blood boil. She had learned to ignore Marcia's taunts, but this was different. They were attacking John, the only person who truly cared about her when everyone turned their backs. "Repeat that," Carmen said, stopping in front of Marcia. Her voice was calm, but her eyes flashed with anger. "What? Does the truth hurt?" Marcia smiled maliciously. "Everyone knows that he only picked you up from the street because—" She didn't finish the sentence. Carmen lunged forward, years of taekwondo training forgotten in the heat of anger. But before she could do anything, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. "Anger is like poison," Master Johnson's voice sounded behind her. "You drink it, hoping the other person dies." Carmen stopped, her body trembling with contained emotion. Master Johnson took the newspaper from Marcia's hands and tore it to pieces. "In this dojo," he said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced everyone, "we don't judge people by what others say. We judge by the character they demonstrate. And if anyone here hasn't yet perceived the character of John and Carmen, perhaps they need to rethink what they've learned about the values of Taekwondo." Marcia lowered her eyes, ashamed. The other students dispersed in silence. Later, in the locker room, Carmen was crying alone when Julia entered. The former rival of Marcia sat next to her without saying anything. "Why can't they leave us alone?" Carmen asked between sobs. "Why after so long?" Julia sighed, remembering her own family battles. "Sometimes people confuse possession with love," she said softly. "Your parents think they have a right to you just because they gave you life. But real family is much more than that." That night, John had a meeting with his lawyer. The news wasn't good. "They've filed for emergency custody," the lawyer explained. "They're claiming that you represent a risk to Carmen." "A risk?" John almost shouted. "I gave her a roof, education, love. Where were they when she was sleeping on the streets?" I know, the lawyer tried to calm him down, "but they have a convincing narrative. They say they were sick, that they needed to step away to treat themselves, that now they're recovered and regretful. And that justifies abandoning a child." For many judges, regretful parents who want a second chance have priority over a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned he is. John sank into the chair, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What can we do? Carmen is old enough that her opinion will be considered by the judge. And we have witnesses, Master Johnson, her teachers, people who can attest to how she has changed since being with you." But there was something more worrying. The lawyer hesitated before continuing. "There's one more thing. Her parents, they're not alone in this. Someone is funding this legal battle." "What do you mean?" "The lawyers they hired are expensive, very expensive, the kind of professional that people who have just come out of a rehab program couldn't afford." John felt a chill run down his spine. Who could have an interest in separating him and Carmen, and why? At home, he found Carmen sleeping on the couch, hugging a photo album. It was a gift he had given her for Christmas, an album with photos of the two of them together, recording special moments from the last few months. He sat next to her, watching her face peaceful in sleep. How could someone look at that girl and think that he represented some kind of threat? Carmen stirred, opening her eyes slowly. "They can't take me, can they?" she asked, her voice sleepy and scared. "Not without a fight," John replied, stroking her hair, "and we both know how to fight pretty well." In the following days, the pressure increased. Carmen's parents began to appear everywhere, at the school door, at the dojo, even on the way home, always keeping a distance, always watching, like predators studying their prey. One afternoon, after training, Carmen was putting away her equipment when she heard a familiar voice. "Honey?" Her mother was standing at the door of the locker room, looking nervous but determined. "You can't be here," Carmen said, recoiling. "Please, just listen to me," her mother pleaded. "We've changed, really. We have a house now, a room just for you. We can be a family again." Carmen looked at that woman who had once been her whole world. She searched her face for some trace of the mother she remembered, but only found a stranger. "I already have a family," she replied simply. "He's not your father," her mother exploded. "He's just a lonely rich man who's using you to fill the void in his life." The words hit Carmen like a slap, but she remained firm. "At least he never abandoned me." Her mother advanced, trying to grab her, but Carmen dodged with the agility that Taekwondo had taught her. "Help!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the dojo. Master Johnson appeared in seconds, followed by other students. Carmen's mother recoiled, realizing that she had gone too far. "You need to leave now," said Master Johnson, his voice calm but firm. "This is private property." When she left, Carmen collapsed into the master's arms, trembling. "Why don't they understand?" she sobbed. "Why can't they just let me be happy?" Master Johnson hugged her, remembering how much Mikey also needed that kind of comfort sometimes. "Because sometimes love can be selfish," he replied softly. "But true love is the one that sets you free, that respects choices, that puts the other's happiness first." That night, while Carmen was sleeping, John received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, but the message was clear: "Give up the girl, or everyone will find out the truth about the accident that killed your family." John felt the blood run cold in his veins. How could someone know about that? What else could they use against him? The battle was far from over, and now it had taken an even darker turn. But one thing was certain: John wouldn't give up on Carmen, no matter the price he had to pay. The anonymous threat deeply disturbed John's sleep that night. He had never told anyone, but he carried a terrible secret about the accident that killed his family. On the night of the tragedy, he had argued with Sarah on the phone. She wanted him to leave the meeting early to go to Mikey's friend's birthday party, but he insisted that work was more important. Sarah left irritated, driving in heavy snowfall. If he had been less stubborn, less focused on work. The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought him back to the present. It was Carmen, who also couldn't sleep. "Can I stay here with you?" she asked, standing at the door of his room. John made space in the bed, and Carmen snuggled next to him, as she did on nights when the nightmares of life on the streets haunted her. "I'm scared," she confessed in a low voice. "Of what, kiddo? That they'll manage to take me, that I'll have to leave all this behind, that I'll never see you again." John felt his heart clench. How to explain to a child that he had the same fear, that the idea of losing her terrified him as much as the idea of returning to his empty life before? "You know," he began, choosing his words carefully, "when I lost Mikey and Sarah, I thought I would never be able to love anyone again. I was so afraid of suffering again that I built walls around me. But then you came along, knocking those walls down one by one, without even realizing it." Carmen raised her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim light of the room. "You knocked down my walls too," she said. "After my parents left, I promised that I would never trust anyone again. But with you, it's different. It's like my heart knows it can trust you." The next morning, during breakfast, the phone rang. It was the lawyer, with urgent news. "Her parents managed to get a preliminary hearing," he informed him. "For next week, they have a judge who is sympathetic to their cause." John felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. 1 week, 7 days to prove that he deserved to keep Carmen. 7 days to fight for the only thing that gave meaning to his life. At training that afternoon, Carmen was distracted. Her movements, normally precise, were uncoordinated. During a kicking sequence, she lost her balance and fell, hitting her, a knee hard on the floor. Master Johnson helped her up, noticing the tears she was trying to hide. "Sometimes," he said while applying ice to her knee, "the biggest fight isn't with the opponent in front of us, but with the fears inside us." "Master," Carmen began, her voice trembling, "what if they succeed? What if I have to leave?" The old master was silent for a moment, remembering when Mikey had asked equally difficult questions. "You know why we practice the same moves thousands of times?" he asked finally. Carmen shook her head, confused by the change of subject. "So that they become part of us. So that even in the most difficult moments, our body remembers what it has learned. The same goes for love, kiddo. Once it becomes part of you, no one can take it away." The master's words brought some comfort, but the reality was still frightening. In the days that followed, the tension only increased. Carmen's parents intensified their campaign. Reports began to appear in local newspapers, insinuating that John had questionable motives for keeping a girl in his house. Neighbors who were once friendly now avoided looking him in the eye. Even some parents of students at the dojo began to question whether it was appropriate for their children to train in the same environment as Carmen. One afternoon, returning from school, Carmen heard 2 classmates whispering, "My mom said he's a strange man. Why would a rich businessman want to take care of a street kid? There must be something wrong. My dad said that rich people always have ulterior motives." Carmen wanted to shout, wanted to defend John, explain how he had saved her life, how he had given her not only a roof, but love, respect, dignity. But the words remained stuck in her throat. At home, she found John in the office, looking older and more tired than ever. Papers were scattered across his desk, legal documents, newspaper reports, old photos. "Come here," he called when he saw her at the door. Carmen approached, noticing a particular photo that he was holding. It showed a younger man smiling next to a beautiful woman and a small boy. "This was the last photo we took together," John said, his voice choked. "It was Mikey's birthday. He had just earned his yellow belt in Taekwondo." Carmen took the photo, carefully studying the smiling faces. "He looked like you," she said softly. "Yes," John smiled sadly, "but he had his mother's temper, stubborn, determined, like you." They were silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. "You know," John continued, "after they were gone, I thought I would never be able to be happy again, that I had lost my chance to have a family. But then you came along, with your clumsy kicks and your huge heart, and showed me that love can find us in the most unexpected times." Carmen felt the tears running down her face. "I don't want to lose another family," she whispered. John pulled her into a tight hug. "You won't lose one, no matter what happens at the hearing, no matter what they say about us. You will always be my daughter, maybe not by blood, but by heart, and that no one can take away." That night, while Carmen was sleeping, John received another anonymous call. "Last chance," said the distorted voice. "Give up the girl, or everyone will know that your family's death was your fault." John hung up the phone, his hands trembling. The secret he had carried for so long threatened to come to light. threatened to destroy everything he had built with Carmen. But how could he choose between his past and his present, between the guilt he carried and the love he felt? The week of the hearing approached, and with it grew the feeling that a storm was coming. A storm that threatened to tear from John the only thing that still gave meaning to his life, and from Carmen, the only person who truly loved her as a daughter. The day of the hearing finally arrived. The night before, no one could sleep properly at John's house. Carmen went from one room to another, restless, memorizing every detail of the place she had learned to call home. She stopped in front of the photos on the wall, touched the furniture with affection, as if she wanted to save every sensation. In the room that John had decorated especially for her, she picked up her white dobok, now with the green belt she had earned with so much effort. She hugged the uniform against her chest, remembering every moment of training, every achievement, every time John had applauded her victories with tears in his eyes. In the kitchen, she found John sitting at the table, a cold cup of coffee forgotten. In front of him, he seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, sitting next to him. John tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "I was thinking about when you arrived here," he said. "Remember how you didn't know how to use silverware properly? How you slept on the floor next to the bed because you weren't used to the soft mattress?" Carmen smiled at the memory. "And how you got nervous when I climbed on the windowsill to watch the sunset?" "I still do," he admitted, affectionately ruffling her hair. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words, with fears that neither of them wanted to express out loud. "I have something for you," John said finally, taking a small box out of his pocket. Inside was a delicate necklace with a tiger pendant. "The tiger is one of the most important symbols of Taekwondo," he explained as he put the necklace around Carmen's neck. "It represents strength, courage, and protection. I thought you could wear it tomorrow to remember that. No matter what happens, you will always have the strength of a tiger inside you." Carmen touched the pendant with trembling fingers, silent tears running down her face. "What if they manage to take me?" she whispered. "Then we'll fight, like you always have, like you taught me to do again. We won't give up on each other, kiddo." The next morning they arrived early at the courthouse. The lawyer was waiting for them at the entrance, his face tense but determined. "Remember," he instructed, "we need to show the judge that Carmen's best interest is to stay with you, John. We have several witnesses, Master Johnson, teachers from the school, even some neighbors who have agreed to speak in your favor." Carmen squeezed John's hand tightly as they entered the courtroom. Her parents were already there, sitting on the other side. Her mother tried to smile at her, but Carmen looked away. The judge was a middle-aged man with a stern but not hostile expression. He began by reviewing the case documents while everyone waited in tense silence. The first to testify was Carmen's mother. She talked about how she had fought against drug addiction, how she had recovered, how she dreamed every day of having her daughter back. "We never wanted to abandon her," she said through tears. "We were sick. We needed to treat ourselves first in order to care for her properly. Now we're healed. We have a house, stable jobs. We can give her the family she deserves." The lawyer for Carmen's parents showed photos of their new home, pay stubs proving stable income, certificates from rehabilitation programs. He painted a picture of regretful parents who deserved a second chance. When it was John's turn to testify, his heart was beating so hard that it seemed everyone in the room could hear it. "I found Carmen in a park, training alone," he began. "She reminded me so much of my son. The same determination, the same passion for fighting. I didn't plan any of this. I wasn't looking for a daughter. But sometimes life gives us gifts that we didn't expect and shows us that we can still love, we can still be happy, even after losing everything." It was then that the lawyer for Carmen's parents asked the question that John feared most. "Mr. Paranoid, Is it true that on the night your wife and son died, you had argued with her on the phone, that she left driving upset because of you?" The silence in the room was deafening. Carmen looked at John, her eyes wide with surprise. "How could they know that?" "Objection, Your Honor." John's lawyer stood up. "That has no relevance to the case." But the damage had already been done. The judge could have sustained the objection, but the doubt had been planted. What other secrets was John hiding? Master Johnson was next to testify. His serene presence brought some calm to the tense room. "I've known John for over 15 years, he said. "I saw the pain he carried after losing his family. I saw how he closed himself off to the world, how he stopped living. But since Carmen came into his life, I've seen something I hadn't seen in a long time. I've seen hope in his eyes." He paused, looking directly at the judge. "Carmen isn't just a student to me. She's a daily reminder that love can heal the deepest wounds. That family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's commitment. It's being present, not only in the happy moments, but especially in the difficult ones." When it was Carmen's turn to testify, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She was nervous, but she maintained the posture that Taekwondo had taught. Her gaze straight back, head held high, steady gaze. "My parents say they abandoned me because they were sick," she began, her voice small but clear. "But do you know what it's really like to be sick? It's sleeping on the streets in the winter, shivering with cold. It's going days without eating properly. It's seeing people passing you by as if you were invisible." Tears began to run down her face, but she continued. "John didn't just give me a roof. He gave me dignity. He taught me that I could be more than my past, that I could dream, that I could make those dreams come true. He's my father, not because a piece of paper says so, but because every day, every moment, he chooses to be." The silence that followed her testimony was heavy with emotion. Even the judge seemed touched. But then, the lawyer for Carmen's parents made his final move. He stood up, holding a thick envelope. "Your Honor, I have here documents that raise serious questions about the character of Mr. Perrenoud." John's heart stopped. Was it the evidence? About the argument with Sarah on the night of the accident? What else had they discovered? The hearing was adjourned for the judge to review the new documents. As they left the room, Carmen held John's hand tightly. "It doesn't matter what's in those papers," she whispered. "It doesn't matter what happened in the past. You're my father, forever." John felt the tears he had held back all day finally fall. Whatever was in those documents, whatever his past hid, nothing could erase the love he felt for that girl who had saved his life as much as he had saved hers. The content of the documents presented was devastating. Not only did they detail John's argument with Sarah on the night of the accident, but they also brought records of his life after the tragedy, periods of deep depression, consultations with psychiatrists, medications prescribed. The lawyers for Carmen's parents painted the picture of a mentally unstable man, using the girl as a substitute for the son he had lost. In the days that followed the hearing, while awaiting the judge's decision, John barely slept. The words of the psychiatric report echoed in his mind. Patient demonstrates signs of unresolved grief and a tendency towards compensatory behaviors. Carmen sensed his anguish. One night, she found him sitting in the dark of the office, staring blankly at an old photo. "They don't understand," she said, sitting next to him. "They don't understand that sometimes broken people come together to become stronger." John looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, trying to smile. "I learned from you," she replied simply. "You taught me that our history doesn't have to define us, that we can choose who we want to be." At the dojo, Master Johnson realized that something was wrong. Carmen was training with an almost frightening intensity, as if trying to exorcise her fears through the movements of taekwondo. "The body speaks what the mouth cannot say," he said one afternoon, after seeing her strike the heavy bag until her hands were red. "Master," Carmen stopped, breathing heavily. "What if they're right? What if John is just trying to replace the son he lost?" The old master considered the question for a moment. "When Mikey died," he began, "John stopped living. He came to work, fulfilled his obligations, but he was like a shadow. His eyes had no sparkle, his voice had no life. For 10 years, I saw a man who existed only to exist." He paused, observing Carmen with affection. "Then you came along, and for the first time in a decade, I saw John smile for real. I saw him worry, care, love again. You didn't replace Mikey, Carmen. You helped a broken man discover that he could still be a father, even carrying his scars." The master's words brought tears to Carmen's eyes. But before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance of the dojo caught her attention. It was her mother, once again trying to force an approach. But this time, there was something different in her expression, an urgency that Carmen had never seen before. "Honey, please," she pleaded, ignoring the protests of the other students. "I need to tell you the truth about why we're doing this. Now." Carmen hesitated. Part of her wanted to run, to hide from that woman who had caused so much pain. But another part, the one that still held memories of a happier time, wanted to understand. "5 minutes," she said finally. "That's all you get." Her mother led her outside the dojo, away from prying eyes. They sat on a nearby bench, keeping a safe distance from each other. "It wasn't our idea," her mother began, twisting her hands nervously. "We were approached by a man. He offered a lot of money to try to get custody back." Carmen felt her heart race. "What man?" "I don't know his real name. He said he knew John, that he had unfinished business with him. Said that using us would be the best way to get to him." The pieces began to fall into place in Carmen's mind. The anonymous calls that John received, the confidential medical documents, the money for the expensive lawyers. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling with contained anger. Her mother looked at the ground, ashamed. "Because yesterday he contacted us again, said that if we couldn't get custody through the judge, we would have to use other means." Carmen's blood ran cold. "What other means?" "He wants us to take you away, by force if necessary. Said he knows people who can help us disappear with you." Carmen stood up abruptly, her whole body shaking. "And you agreed to this, after everything you've already put me through?" "No," her mother also stood up. "That's why I'm telling you. I know I've been a terrible mother, that I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't let you get hurt again." Tears streamed down her mother's face, and for the first time in years, Carmen saw sincerity in her eyes. "You need to warn John," her mother continued. "This man, he's obsessed. Said that John destroyed his life, that now he's going to destroy his too." Carmen ran back to the dojo, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. She needed to find John. She needed to warn him. But when she got there, Master Johnson informed her that he had left earlier, saying he needed to take care of something important. She tried calling his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called his office. The secretary said he hadn't shown up there all day. Panic began to grow in her chest. Where could he have gone? What could that mysterious man be planning? It was then that she remembered something that John had mentioned once, on a particularly difficult night. A place where he went when he needed to think, when the pain of loss became unbearable. "The cemetery," she whispered to herself. "He must have gone to visit Mikey and Sarah." Without thinking twice, she hailed a cab. Throughout the journey, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The driver tried to make conversation a few times, but she barely heard. Her mind focused only on finding John before it was too late. What she didn't know was that her intuition was right. John really was at the cemetery, but he wasn't alone, and the conversation that was happening at that moment would forever change the course of their lives. When Carmen arrived at the cemetery, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange. The place was practically deserted, except for an elderly employee who took care of the flowers. Her heart beat erratically as she walked among the graves, looking for the place where she knew John's family was buried. From a distance, she spotted two figures near the grave of Sarah and Mikey. She recognized John immediately, but the other man she had never seen before. He was tall, with graying hair, and something in his posture made Carmen hide behind a nearby tree. "You don't understand," she heard the stranger's voice, filled with bitterness. "While you were building your empire, while you were receiving applause and honors, I lost everything. My company, my reputation, my family." "Robert," John's voice sounded tired. "It's been so long. What happened was a terrible accident, but—" "Accident?" Robert laughed humorlessly. "You call what you did to me an accident. You knew that contract was important to my company. You knew it was my last chance to stay in business. But no, the great John Perrineau couldn't pass up the opportunity to crush another competitor." Carmen moved a little closer, trying to understand what was happening. The cold evening wind carried the words to her. "I didn't know things were so bad for you," John replied. "When I found out you had lost everything, I tried to contact you, but you had disappeared." "Of course I had disappeared. What choice did I have? My wife left me, took our kids. I ended up on the streets, drinking to forget. And you kept climbing, growing as if nothing had happened." It was then that Carmen understood. This man, Robert, was responsible for everything. He was the one manipulating her parents, trying to use her past to hurt her, to get to John. "And then," Robert continued, his voice growing more bitter, "I see in the newspapers that the great businessman had taken in a street girl. How ironic. The man who destroyed so many lives now playing the benefactor. That's when I realized this was my chance to make you feel the same pain I felt. Leave Carmen out of this." John's voice had a warning tone. "She's just a kid. Just like my kids were just kids when they had to move to another city, change schools, see their father being called a failure. Do you think you can simply make up for all the harm you've done by taking in a street girl? Do you think that clears your conscience?" Carmen saw Robert take a step towards John, his hands trembling with anger. "You know what's worse," he continued. "While I was investigating your past, I discovered something interesting about your family's death. The argument on the phone, your wife driving nervously in the snow. I imagine how Carmen would react to knowing that the man she considers a father is responsible for the death of his own son." John staggered as if he had been punched. "You had no right. Those records were confidential." "Right?" Robert laughed bitterly. "What right did you have to destroy my life? Now it's my turn, John. I'm going to make you lose everything again. The girl, your reputation, everything." It was at that moment that Carmen couldn't take it anymore. She came out of her hiding place, running towards them. "I already know everything," she shouted, making both men turn around in surprise. "My mother told me about you, about your plan." "Carmen, no." John tried to reach her, but she was already between the two men. "You think you can use me to hurt him?" she continued, facing Robert. "You think discovering that he feels guilty about his family's death will make me love him less?" Robert seemed disconcerted for a moment. He clearly didn't expect a 12-year-old girl to confront him in this way. "You don't understand," he tried to say, but Carmen interrupted him. "No, you don't understand. You know why John is different. From you? Because when he lost everything, when the pain was unbearable, he chose not to let hate consume his heart. And when he found me, he wasn't looking for redemption. He was just trying to prevent another child from suffering like he suffered." Tears streamed down Carmen's face, but her voice remained firm. And you know what? Even if he made mistakes in the past, even if he carries that guilt, it doesn't change what he did for me. It doesn't change the fact that when everyone had abandoned me, including my own parents, he gave me a chance. He gave me a home, a family, a future. John watched the scene in silence, his heart overflowing with love and pride for that girl who had become so strong, so wise. Robert seemed stunned. It was as if Carmen's words had pierced the armor of bitterness that he had built over the years. "You've spent so much time planning your revenge," Carmen continued, her voice softening, "that you've forgotten to live. You've forgotten that there's always a choice. Just as my parents chose to abandon me, just as John chose to help me, you can also choose. You can choose to let the hate go." The silence that followed her words was heavy with emotion. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. Robert looked at the grave of Sarah and Mikey, then at John, and finally at Carmen. Something in his face had changed, as if a mask had fallen. I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I've spent so much time planning this." "You can start again," Carmen said softly. "Just like I started. Just like John started." At that moment, as if the sky itself wanted to participate in the scene, it began to rain. A light rain, almost. A drizzle that seemed to wash away the bitterness accumulated for years. John took a step forward, extending his hand to Robert. "I can't change the past," he said. "I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can try to help now, if you allow it." Robert looked at the outstretched hand, decades of anger and resentment fighting against that moment of possible redemption. Carmen watched, holding her breath. There, among the graves, under the fine rain, 3 broken lives had a chance to find healing. But first, someone needed to take the first step. What happened next would forever change the destiny of all of them. Robert stared at John's outstretched hand for a long moment. The rain was increasing, but no one moved. It was as if time had stopped in that cemetery, awaiting a decision that could change the course of all those broken lives. Finally, with a trembling hand, Robert accepted John's gesture. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of years of bitterness being, little by little, transformed into the possibility of forgiveness. "I don't know how to stop hating," Robert admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Nobody does," replied Carmen, taking a step towards the 2 men. "We only learn by trying. Every day is a new chance to choose love instead of hate." John looked at that girl who had entered his life so unexpectedly, now speaking with the wisdom of someone who had known both pain and healing. "Let's get out of this rain," he suggested. "There's a diner nearby. We can talk better." In the small diner near the cemetery, the 3 sat at a secluded table. The place was almost empty at that hour, just an elderly couple having tea in the opposite corner. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, bringing some comfort after the tension of the last few moments. Robert held his cup tightly, as if he needed something to anchor himself in reality. His eyes, once full of hate, now seemed lost, almost scared. "After I lost everything," he began hesitantly, "I spent months living on the streets. I drank to forget, to not feel. I saw my kids from afar sometimes at the school exit, but I never had the courage to approach them. What father wants his children to see him like that?" Carmen felt her heart clench. How many times had she seen that same pain in the eyes of people she met during her time on the streets? "One day," Robert continued, "I saw a report about you, John, about how your company had grown even more, how you had become one of the most respected businessmen in the country. Something inside me broke that day. It was as if all my failure was being rubbed in my face." John listened in silence, letting Robert pour out years of accumulated bitterness. I started following you, investigating your life. I found out about the accident, about your family, and when I saw in the newspapers that you had taken in a street girl." He looked at Carmen. "I thought it was fate giving me a chance for revenge." "So you contacted my parents," Carmen completed. Robert nodded, ashamed. "They were really trying to recover, but the money I offered, it was too tempting. I manipulated their fears, their insecurities. I used the legal system to try to destroy the only good thing that had happened in your lives." Silent tears streamed down Robert's face now, but seeing you two together, hearing the words of this girl, I realized that I've become exactly the kind of person I used to despise. Someone willing to hurt an innocent child just to satisfy his thirst for revenge. John took a deep breath before speaking. "You were right about one thing," he said. "I have a lot of guilt to carry. What happened to your company? I was so focused on growing, on being the best, that I didn't care about the consequences. And that night, the argument with Sarah..." His voice faltered, and Carmen held his hand under the table, offering silent support. "But you know what, Carmen? You taught me," he continued after a moment, "that our scars don't have to define us, that we can always choose a different path." Robert looked out the diner window, observing the rain that continued to fall outside. "My kids," he said softly, "must be teenagers now. Sometimes I wonder if they still remember me, if they still think about the father who abandoned them." "It's never too late to try to fix things," said Carmen. "I thought I would never have a family again, that I would never trust anyone again. But here I am." A thoughtful silence fell over the table. Outside, the rain began to subside, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. "What happens now?" Robert asked finally. "First," John replied, "you're going to withdraw all the accusations against me in the custody case. You're going to tell the truth about how you manipulated Carmen's parents." Robert nodded without hesitation. "And then," John continued, "I'm going to help you start over. I can't undo the past, but I can give you a chance to build a different future, maybe even help you reconnect with your children." Robert looked up, surprised by the offer. "Why, after everything I've done?" "Because that's what real people do," replied Carmen. "They forgive, they help, they choose to be light even when they've known so much darkness." At that moment, John's cell phone rang. It was his lawyer. "John," he said, his voice agitated, "the judge wants to see us first thing tomorrow morning. It looks like he's going to announce his decision on the custody." Everyone's heart at the table seemed to stop for a moment. After everything that had happened, after all the truths revealed, there was still this last battle to be faced. "Don't worry," said Robert, a new determination in his voice. "I'm going to tell the judge everything, how I manipulated her parents, how I created this whole circus for revenge." Carmen looked at John, her eyes shining with hope. "It's going to be all right," she said, squeezing his hand. "It has to be." As they drove home that night, the city seemed different. The lights shone more intensely, the air felt lighter. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from their shoulders. But there was still one last chapter to be written in this story, and the next morning, in court, all the truths would come to light, forever changing the destiny of that family that love had built. The morning of the final hearing dawned, with a timid sun trying to break through the clouds. Carmen woke up before the alarm clock rang, her heart beating fast with the prospect of what was to come. She put on her prettiest dress, a gift that John had given her on her last birthday, and fastened the necklace with the tiger pendant around her neck. During breakfast, neither she nor John could eat properly. The silence between them was heavy with expectation and fear. Before they left home, Carmen stopped at the door of her room, looking at every detail as if she wanted to engrave everything in her memory. "It's going to be all right," John said. noticing her hesitation. "We have the truth on our side now." At the courthouse they found a surprise. Robert was already there, talking to the lawyers. He looked different from the embittered man of the day before. There was a new dignity in his posture, as if the weight of years of hate had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Carmen's parents were also present, sitting in a far corner. Her mother had deep, dark circles under her eyes, and her father seemed to have aged years in a few days. When Carmen passed by them, her mother tried to smile, but the gesture came out more like a grimace of pain. Master Johnson had come to offer his support. He was sitting in the front row, his serene presence bringing some calm to the tense environment. Next to him, to Carmen's surprise, was Julia, her friend from the dojo. When the judge entered the room, everyone stood up. He looked more serious than usual, his eyes scanning the room as if assessing each person present. "Before announcing my decision," he began, "I have been informed that there are new elements to be considered in this case. Mr. Robert Martinez wishes to make a statement." Robert stood up, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. He seemed nervous, but determined. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm despite the evident nervousness, "I need to confess something. I was the one who orchestrated this whole situation. I manipulated Carmen's parents. I financed their legal battle, all as part of a plan for personal revenge against John Perrineau." A murmur ran through the room. The judge frowned but motioned for Robert to continue. "I was consumed by hate, by bitterness. I used an innocent child as a pawn in my game of revenge. But yesterday..." His voice faltered for a moment. "Yesterday I realized the monster I had become. I saw the true love between John and Carmen. I saw how she found in him not just a guardian, but a real father." Robert then took a folder full of documents from his pocket. "Here is everything, Your Honor. Proof of the transfers I made to Carmen's. Parents, emails detailing the plan, recordings of our conversations. I am prepared to face the legal consequences of my actions." The judge examined the documents in silence, his face revealing no emotion. Then he looked at Carmen's parents. "Do you confirm these allegations?" Carmen's mother stood up, tears running down her face. "Yes, Your Honor. When Mr. Martinez contacted us, we were really trying to recover. But the money, it was so much money. He said we could give a better life to Carmen, that it was our chance to make up for the abandonment." She paused, sobbing. "But seeing our daughter now, seeing how happy she is, how strong she is, we realized that we were selfish. We weren't thinking about her well-being, we were thinking about ourselves." Carmen's father also stood up. "We withdraw our request for custody, Your Honor. Our daughter already has a father, a much better father than we ever were." The silence that followed these words was heavy with emotion. Carmen felt the tears running down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. The judge adjusted his glasses, looking directly at Carmen. "Miss Carmen, in cases like this, it's important to hear the opinion of the child involved. Would you like to say something?" Carmen stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She touched the tiger pendant around her neck, seeking strength. "Your Honor," she began, her voice small but clear. "For a long time, I thought family was just a matter of blood, that because I no longer had my biological parents, I was doomed to be alone. But John taught me that family is much more than that." She paused, looking at the man who had changed her life. "He found me when I had nothing, when I was invisible to the world. He didn't just give me a roof over my head or food. He gave me dignity. He gave me dreams. He gave me love. He taught me that no matter how many times we fall, what matters is how many times we get back up." The judge listened attentively, his face softening for the first time. "I know he was also broken when he found me," Carmen continued, "that he carried a lot of pain, a lot of guilt, but instead of letting that pain turn his heart into stone, he chose to use his experience to help someone who was suffering. That to me, is what being a real dad is all about." John couldn't hold back the tears now. Master Johnson smiled gently, as if he had always known this moment would come. The judge remained silent for a few minutes, reviewing all the documents before him. The tension in the room was palpable. "Well," he said finally, "considering the new elements presented, the confessions made today, and especially listening to the moving testimony of this young lady, my decision becomes clear." Everyone in the room held their breath. Carmen squeezed John's hand tightly. "I grant permanent custody of Carmen to Mr. John Perrineau, with the possibility of initiating an adoption process if they so desire." The room erupted in applause and tears of joy. Carmen jumped into John's arms, sobbing with happiness. Master Johnson and Julia hugged, overcome with emotion. But the story wasn't over yet. There was one last chapter to be written, one last lesson to be learned about forgiveness, new beginnings, and the true meaning of family. In the days that followed the judge's decision, life began to find a new rhythm. The first change happened right outside the courthouse when Carmen's mother asked to speak with her and John in private. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," she began, twisting her hands nervously, "but I would like to be able to be a part of your life in some way, even if it's just from afar." Carmen looked at John for guidance. He simply smiled, gently leaving the decision in her hands. "Maybe," Carmen replied after a moment of reflection, "we can start slowly. A diner visit every now and then to get to know each other again." Her mother's face lit up with hope. Her father, who had remained silent, also approached hesitantly. Could we come see you train someday?" he asked timidly. Carmen felt something stir in her heart. It was strange to see her parents like this, humble, repentant, trying to build bridges where there had only been chasms before. "The next regional championship is in 3 months," she said. "If you want to go." Robert, who had been watching the scene from afar, also approached. He seemed lighter, as if the weight of years of bitterness had finally begun to dissipate. "John," he called out, "that offer of help, is it still on the table?" John nodded, extending his hand to his former rival. "Come to my office tomorrow. We'll see what we can do." At the dojo, things were also changing. Carmen's story had spread, and now other students were seeking her out to train together, to hear her advice, to learn from her experience. Even Marcia, who had been so hostile to her, came to apologize. "I was wrong," she admitted, surprising Carmen during a training break. "I was so envious of your talent that I didn't realize how hard you had fought to get here." Master Johnson watched these transformations with a serene smile, as if he had always known this moment would come. "See," he said to Carmen one afternoon, while helping her with a new kicking sequence. "Sometimes we need to go through storms to learn to dance in the rain." At home, John began the official adoption process. It was a long and bureaucratic procedure, but this time they were in no rush. They knew they were on the right path. One night, while organizing Carmen's room, now definitely her room, they found the old doll she had brought from the streets. "Do you want to throw it away?" John asked, noticing how Carmen was looking at the worn toy. "No," she replied, holding the doll carefully. "It reminds me of where I came from, of everything I went through to get here. I want to keep it forever." John understood. Just as he kept the photos of Sarah and Mikey, that doll was a reminder that our scars are part of who we are. Robert kept his word. With John's help, he began working in the company's social responsibility area, using his own experience to help people who, like him, had lost everything. More importantly, after a lot of therapy and preparation, he finally mustered the courage to reach out to his children. The reunion wasn't easy. There was a lot of hurt, a lot of unanswered questions. But it was a start. "You know," he said to John during a lunch, "seeing you with Carmen, I learned that being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, even when it hurts. It's about trying, even when it seems impossible. Carmen's parents were also doing their part. They continued their treatment, now with renewed motivation. Little by little, they were building a new relationship with their daughter, no longer based on guilt or obligation, but on mutual respect and understanding. One Sunday, everyone gathered for lunch at John's house. It was a scene that no one would have imagined possible a few months before. Robert talking animatedly with Master Johnson about Eastern philosophy. Carmen's parents listening attentively as she talked about her progress in Taekwondo. John at the grill, a serene smile on his face. Carmen watched everything with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. How was it possible that so much love could be born from so much pain? At the end of the afternoon, as everyone said goodbye, her mother hugged her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us a second chance." "Third," Carmen corrected with a small smile. "This is our third chance, and they say three's the magic number." Later, after everyone had left, Carmen found John in the garden, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "About how funny life is," he replied. "Sometimes we lose so much that we think we'll never recover. But then, when we least expect it, it surprises us with new beginnings." Carmen rested her head on his shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the aroma of the night. "You know what I learned from all this?" she said after a moment. "That family isn't just who gives us life, it's who teaches us how to live it." John kissed the top of her head, his heart overflowing with love for that kiddo who had transformed his life in so many ways. But there was still one last surprise waiting for them, a revelation that would forever change how they understood their story together. And that revelation would come from where they least expected it. The revelation came on an ordinary autumn afternoon, when the leaves were beginning to turn golden and the wind was blowing colder. Carmen was training at the dojo, preparing for the regional championship that would take place in a few weeks, when Master Johnson called her into his office. "There's something I need to show you," he said, rummaging through an old drawer in his desk. "Something I've kept for many years, waiting for the right moment." He took out an envelope yellowed by time, the edges already worn. Inside was a photograph that made Carmen's heart stop for a moment. It was an image of the dojo, clearly taken many years ago. In it, a small boy smiled proudly in his white dobok, showing off a new yellow belt. Beside him, a younger man, John. Carmen recognized with a pang in her heart, smiled with the same pride. But that wasn't what caught her attention. In the background of the photo, almost hidden, there was a woman. She was holding a small girl in her arms, no more than 2 years old, and something in her face made Carmen feel like she'd been punched in the stomach. That's my mother," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the image. Master Johnson nodded slowly. "Your mother worked here for a short time as a cleaning assistant. It was around the time that Mikey, John's son, was starting to train." Carmen couldn't take her eyes off the photo. There she was, still a baby, in the same space where she was now training, where she had found her way back to life. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice choked. "Because some truths need to be discovered at the right moment," replied the old master. "When you showed up here with John that first day, I recognized you immediately. You had the same determined eyes as when you were a baby." Carmen felt tears streaming down her face. "So it wasn't a coincidence. Me finding John, me ending up here. In life," said Master Johnson softly, "there are no coincidences. There are encounters that were destined to happen, even if we have to wait years for them." That night, Carmen showed the photo to John. He watched as different emotions crossed her face: surprise, recognition, understanding, and finally, a kind of peace. "I remember now," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your mother, she always stopped by to watch Mikey train. She said that one day her little girl would also be a great fighter." Carmen sat down next to him on the sofa, both still looking at the photo that connected their pasts in a way that no one could have imagined. "Maybe," she began hesitantly, "maybe it wasn't just chance that led me to that park that day. Maybe some part of me remembered this place, this energy." John hugged her tightly, letting his own tears finally fall. "You know what this means?" he asked softly. "It means that Mikey, in some way, helped us find each other. He always loved seeing you, always smiled when your mother brought you." The revelation brought a new dimension to their relationship. They weren't just two broken souls that fate had brought together. They were two lives that had already touched before, that somehow had always been connected. When they told Carmen's parents, her mother broke down in deep sobs. "I remember," she said between sobs. "I remember how happy I was working there, how I dreamed that one day you would be like that little boy, so dedicated, so full of life." "Mikey," Carmen said softly. "His name was Mikey." Her father, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Maybe when we abandoned you, some greater force guided you back to where you started, to where you were always meant to be." Master Johnson, when he learned that they had shared the revelation, smiled his usual serene smile. "You see," he said, "the universe has a very particular way of fixing things. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." The following weeks were of profound transformation. The discovery of this ancient connection brought a new dimension of healing to everyone involved. Robert, when he heard the story, felt as if a final weight had been lifted from his heart. "It's as if fate itself is telling us that forgiveness is the only way," he said, now actively working on social projects with John. The regional championship finally arrived. Carmen had never felt so prepared, so complete. In the stands, an unprecedented scene. John, her biological parents, Robert, Master Johnson, all united, cheering her on. When her name was called for the final, Carmen closed her eyes for a moment. She touched the tiger pendant around her neck and smiled, feeling as if Mikey was there too somehow, completing that circle of love and redemption. The fight was intense, each movement a celebration not only of her technique, but of her journey. When the referee raised her arm declaring her victory, the tears that ran down her face were not just of joy. They were of gratitude, of understanding, of peace. Later at home, celebrating with everyone who had become her extended family, Carmen watched the people she loved talking, laughing, sharing stories. John approached, holding 2 glasses of juice. "What are you thinking about, little champion?" Carmen smiled, taking one of the glasses. "About how sometimes we need to get completely lost to find our true way back home." John nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. Together, they looked at the photo of Mikey that now occupied a place of honor on the living room wall, next to Carmen's medals. "He would be proud of you," John said softly. "Of us," Carmen corrected. "He would be proud of us." And there, in that house full of love and laughter, 2 souls who had known the deepest pain finally understood that sometimes we need to lose one family to find another, that sometimes fate has bigger plans than we can imagine, and that always, always, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, even if we need help to find it. Carmen looked at the sky through the window where the first stars were beginning to shine. Somewhere up there, she was sure, Mikey was smiling, knowing that he had helped his dad find a new reason to live and a lost kiddo to find her way back home. The circle was complete. The story had found its end, and it was more perfect than any of them could have imagined.